Another combat beta has shown up in Runescape once again, and this time it is testing between the new tier 95 dual wields and the potential passives they might have. And today I'll be talking about my overall thoughts with the passives and some of the directions they might be going with the game. Overall, this video is basically going to be a discussion that could possibly turn into some type of giant rant, but I will be covering the tier 95 Magic Duel Wield weapons, my thoughts on charging as a mechanic overall, and my thoughts on builds overall in RuneScape, and why that might not be the best idea moving forward in this game. Before we get into this discussion, I want to make a note here that in the comments below, please keep it civil and productive. And if you're going to entertain discussion about these ideas and/or topics, then please keep it to that discussion. Insulting others and grandstanding for opinion to try and back up your claims is simply not going to be tolerated here and does not add credibility to any argument you might make. Now, I know some people, and probably quite a few people, are actually going to disagree with one or more points in this video, but that's why I am putting this here, because I am fine with open discourse and discussion in a constructive manner, but I simply will not put up with someone name-calling, grandstanding, or using other ridiculous ideas to try and push a point because they are trying to win an argument rather than have an actual discussion here. So with all that being said, keep it civil, keep it constructive, and let's get into this video. So if I bring up the main RuneScape website here, just runescape.com, and we go here to the news section, there is a tier 95 Magic Duel Wield beta. So we'll give this a click, and they give a bunch of different information about it, basically what's going on, the different passive effects, and how to get involved with the combat beta. And essentially there are two different ideas for passive effects. The first two being the same, roughly speaking. They both generate stacks and consume those stacks to help with the cooldown of wild magic. The third one essentially is using bleeds to build up stacks and give you certain effects. Think of the Scourge effect from Melee. Although with Scourge you're using all abilities to build up stacks to get a bleed, here you're using bleeds to get effects and boost your actual bleeds. Now this third effect is an interesting idea, but I didn't find it all too useful. I wasn't too happy with it. Mostly it took way too long to build up stacks and get any sort of damage out. I could see this being used in a strict magic camp sense, but that's the only place I see it being used. And even then, it has to be a boss fight where you're able to build up these stacks over time, or it would just end up being a giant pre-build thing of building up all your stacks, running in. Overall, this effect, it has potential as an idea, but it would need some heavy reworking to actually fit into what we should see as a passive effect on dual wield weapons. Now, the first two sets, like I said before, they consume stacks to help with wild magic's cooldown. Now the first one actually has a mechanic with it where each consumption of the stack gives you adrenaline to get back to other thresholds, and it takes the cooldown by 6 seconds. There's no coin flip involved, there's no RNG involved. It is a straight do this with these abilities and get this effect or reward type of idea, no questions asked. The second one adds a coin flip in to where it roughly works out to be the same, but I found the coin flip kind of annoying. Yes, you have a decent chance to instantly refresh wild magic, but being you can only hold 2 stacks, being that we only hold 2 stacks, that's a 70% chance, which yes is pretty high, but then it comes to those points where if you're trying to build a rotation, it would get rather annoying, especially with the improvisation required with adrenaline management. I'd rather not have something else to add in, so if I was to pick anything from these 3 effects, I would go with the first one. Now, a few different people I've spoken with about the beta, they were in my chat and whatnot, we all kind of agreed that this passive effect does feel slightly anemic, but I want to say that is a good thing, because this will come up later when I'm talking about builds and whatnot. I don't think that a lot of power creep should come from passive effects and or weapon special attacks. I think a passive effect should be something that you can either weave into your current rotation that you're doing or just have a nice benefit for holding the weapons. But since the only interaction information here is you're holding these weapons. I don't believe it should be too powerful of an effect. And the way to add skill expression into this is by using some type of stack building operation, which they are doing. And overall, I think reducing the cooldown of wild magic is an interesting effect where if you do your rotations correctly, you'll get an extra wild magic in your sunshine, maybe a second wild magic. And wild magic is a strong threshold, but it is not the strongest threshold. So it's not something that's really going to be worthwhile to absolutely spam out, but getting an extra WM in your sun will be beneficial. And I think that is perfectly fine. If this is how it came into game, was with this passive effect, and that worked with FSOA, everything else stayed the same with magic, I'd be fine with that. Now, there's no mention here really about the special attacks. All the weapons did have a special attack. They were all the same, but there was no information on it. It was really weak for 27% adrenaline. I think it did like 5k total, and I believe it was just quite literally a placeholder for something else. So it is what it is. I'm not going to harp on the weapon spec too much, but it was very anemic for the adren consumption, which I'm sure whoever designed it knew that. They just wanted a placeholder. Now, something else they did in this combat beta as a test is removed all of the dual wield and two-hand requirements from abilities. So you could use G-Conk with a staff, you could use G-Sonic with dual wield, you could Magma Tempest with dual wield, and it was interesting to play with. However, I'm not the biggest fan of this idea, and it'll fit more into the build discussion I'll do later, but suffice to say, I think it is okay to have some abilities locked into two-hand or dual wield, because it does require that little bit of extra effort in order to get more damage out, which I believe magic is probably the best case example we have of a combat style with a very linear, more effort equals more reward in damage, which is probably why I like the combat style the most. If you put in all of the effort, you get all of the magic damage that there is. Now, yes, magic is not as strong compared to the other combat styles right now, but that's not the point here that I am making. The point that I am making is that magic is very good for effort to reward, which is important for a game like RuneScape that has such a high skill ceiling. If the easiest to do combat style does the most damage, then there is no point to do anything else. I've discussed this before on the channel, probably a year ago. But when you do something like that, the game gets really stale. There's no innovation. There's no reason to push the other combat styles. And I don't believe that's what RuneScape is about. RuneScape at its core is a massive grind of a game with a skill ceiling larger than some of the palaces in this world. And the ability of this community to absolutely figure out and test new ideas and try new things each day, continually improving this game, is the rabbit hole that I fell down a long time ago and has kept me going. Okay, before I fall into that absolute rant and discussion, let's actually get into the other parts of this video. One final note about the passive effect that I liked the most, the first one, before we get into these other topics, is that the stacks disappear when you switch away with weapons, and I'd absolutely like to see this changed. I want the synergy of two-hand and dual wield and how they fit together currently to remain when the tier 95 passive comes out, and we'll get into it later on the builds thing, and you'll be able to kind of connect the dots on why I think this should be the case. But overall, those stacks should stay on your character if you've built them up. Even if you switch away weapons, the Lang Sword stacks will stay with your character even if you switch to like a T-Maul or something like that. So just one more quick note on that, and let's get back to the video. So in this beta, there were charging effects on all of the weapons because the point of this beta was for us to test the different passive effects and see which one we liked the most, rather than seeing how well they fit into Magic's entire ecosystem, which is fair enough. They do need some concrete data on which passives we like. However, they could have killed two birds with one stone, where instead of letting us have all of the weapons at once, we could just exchange them out. We wouldn't have needed the charging passive, and we could actually test it within Magic's entire ecosystem rather than just in a vacuum. And this leads me into the fact that I don't really agree with charging being in game. Now, that might be a hot take, but here is the explanation for it. Charging was put in game to limit players based on the complaints of others for Switchscape being in game. And this does not help out the casual player in the slightest. In fact, it doesn't change their gameplay at all. Now, why would this be the case, you might ask? It is the case because casual players are going going to play how they want to play, regardless of what is or is not in game. The complaining minority of PVMers that will just sit there and complain about the game's current state no matter what will always be there regardless of what update comes into game. And charging only really affects those players that are willing to improve, willing to try new things, and push the limits of this game even further. In my opinion, it's mostly a coping mechanism for people who don't want to put in the work and want to have damage done, knowing that the top players can't use every switch in the book. Now, this phenomena is not unique to RuneScape, where you have a large pool of people in more the casual setting. This could be applied to sports, this could be applied to games, it could be applied to music, it could be applied to driving, it could be applied to hiking, it can be applied to literally anything that humans interact with for either enjoyment or competition, in which the large majority of the population will focus on what the top 0.5% and top 1% of that population is doing. And it's very common for people to see what the top 0.5 to 1% of a community are doing and get very overwhelmed, thinking that they will never be able to achieve this. Now, most rational people will realize, all right, those top players have put in the work to really eke out every last bit of performance possible, but they are mostly worried about very small increases and are willing to do anything to get those small increases because it is either a competitive edge or it is more optimal. And RuneScape players are no stranger to this idea of doing things that are the most optimal. You will even see this in the casual player bases, where they are doing the most optimal things for the amount of effort they're willing to put into the game. Things like optimizing Revo++ bars, using things like Animate Dead to reduce food consumption, things like darkness and necromancy coming into game. And I believe this in large part is just a giant coping mechanism that people come up with simply to excuse the fact for them not wanting to put in the effort, the ignorance of realizing that those small gains for a lot of work are not going to help them in the slightest, or something based off of insecurity because they are not as good as that top player and they're looking for reasons to not actually improve, but they just want to sit there and come up with excuses, which we all do in some aspect of our life. No one here is not guilty of this. We are humans after all and are imperfect creatures. And therein lies the problem with charging. It is only a cope to limit the top end players and coming up with creative rotations, sourcing out every last 0.1% DPM because that's what we enjoy doing on this game. We will push this game to its absolute limit and beyond in the search of efficiency and or competitive edge. That is what we enjoy, and there's nothing wrong with enjoying that. And there should be nothing wrong with a casual player base not engaging in those high sweat, high effort methods. Just as I'm sure y'all are well aware, I put relatively high level guides out as far as YouTube guides are concerned. Are they the absolute tippy top of PVM and RuneScape? No, because I'm not at that level of PVM. But my guides are also not for everyone. Some people don't want to put in that level of effort, and that's perfectly fine. But for those who do want to see my perspective and pull bits of information out to implement in their own learning process, those video guides exist for those players. And that mentality of supporting people on their quest to learning more about this game and getting to the level in which they're comfortable at is what should be encouraged. Not putting harsh limits on players because they're getting quote-unquote too good at the game. Negative arguments like this only alienate the top players from the casual player base even more, because the top PVMers, they're just playing the game as they see fit and how they enjoy playing the game. And when the larger community gets angry for how far they push, this could be tied into crab mentality almost, where you have a bunch of crabs in a bucket, and if one is trying to escape, the other crabs will actually pull it back, dooming them all, rather than letting the one escape. But I digress. and instead we should be focusing on uplifting people and encouraging these things more. If people want to push the limits, let them push the limits. If they don't, that's okay. They're allowed to not push the limits. Now, the counterpoint to this is saying, well, charging limits the amount of switchscape and limits the amount of unnecessary switching that exists in this game. And I understand this argument fully. As far as things like Ring of Vigor passive coming into game, enchantments and other things like that, I think these are nice features because they fall more so into the quality of life rather than actual just switchscape reduction for the sake of reducing switchscape based off of the arguments made earlier. And I will agree there are some potential switches in game that are rather annoying and could be looked at and removed as far as a quality of life is concerned, but charging just keeps the item in game and forces you to stop switching with it rather than coming up with a creative solution to actually make it a more useful item or more useful effect. Alrighty, I think I've spoken long enough about item charging and why I think it is terrible for the game. The last topic I wanted to touch on in here is builds in RuneScape. And what do I mean by builds? There seems to be a notion that we want to separate Duel Wield and Two-Hander into their own identities within a combat style and somehow have these balanced out with the other combat styles. Essentially breaking this up into 7 different combat styles, because if Duel Wield and Two-Handers become unique enough to where they are different, I'm gonna count that as its own combat style, even though it might be under the branch of melee or magic or range or whatever else we're talking about. And simply put, I think this is a terrible idea and should not be explored further within RuneScape. We've already had one hell of a time trying to balance out 3 combat styles before Necromancy came out. Necromancy came out and put a giant wrench in the works, and it has taken quite a while to get Necromancy, with several updates coming into the game, to a place where it is actually somewhat balanced with the other combat styles, and the other combat styles had to be brought up significantly to be balanced with it. And so now, once we're in a relatively decent stage, we all of a sudden want to change the identities of each combat style and try and balance all of those accordingly. This, simply put, is borderline impossible. Now, where am I getting these ideas from that have been talked about? There are a few RuneScape live streams where I've seen clips of JMod saying they want each of the weapon styles to have their own identity, where something like Two-Hand Melee is focused on big, powerful strikes, and smaller Duel Wield weapons are focused more on bleeds because of ideas like, you know, death by 1,000 scratches, where Duel Wield would essentially be a lot lower damage but more DPM focused. And I think these ideas are missing the point entirely. RuneScape 3, for those who are unaware, has abilities in-game. Abilities are what sets RuneScape's combat system apart from its older versions of the game. The combat styles already as a whole have a pretty good identity to them, where melee is mostly focused on burst damage, but over the years has been given some sustainment by trying to play with bleeds, and we all know relatively how well that worked out, which was not good at all. It took several updates from several pieces of content in order to get melee on a relatively fair playing field, and then it took removing the hit cap entirely for melee to actually be able to cook at a few places. But with abilities being the unique thing about this game, why are we so focused on weapons and weapon effects in order to get our big amounts of power creep? Instead of adding in a bunch of passive effects for every single item and active effects and special attacks and other things like that, why not focus on what actually makes this game unique and focus on adding abilities into the game to allow us to come up with better rotations for certain encounters? Now, something like this is obviously a huge design philosophy change, but is something I think in the big picture would actually work out very nicely. Now, y'all out there might be yelling at your monitors right now, hey car guy, if everything had a unique identity, there could be a bunch of abilities abilities in game for those identities, and that would make the gameplay ultra unique. Why aren't you on board with the build idea? And that is something that I think is also a unique portion that RuneScape has that no other MMO really does have. From anyone I have spoken to who plays other MMOs, gear switching is not a thing that you can really do in other games. Hybrid setups and weapon switching is not really explored in the other games, and that is what I think gives RuneScape its unique ability. Since its inception, it has had gear switching as a thing. You've been able to switch combat styles. It's what made PvP nice back in the day, doing hybrid and tribrid fights. Being able to hybrid in a PvM scenario has borderline revolutionized the entire PvM scene in this game. It is another massively unique characteristic to the game, and blundering that away to lock everyone into just camping dual wield melee or just camping two-hand melee and having all of these charges and lockdowns in place in order to force everyone into a specific build, quote unquote, I think is absolutely getting rid of one of the main unique characteristics that RuneScape 3 has. And that ties back into the issue of balancing. In the beginning of this section, I said it's already difficult to balance 4 combat styles, and essentially we'd be getting 7, but then that also doesn't include things like poison builds, so you're adding those into the other combat styles, and it gets out of hand very, very quickly and would create a very volatile economy, because as soon as one of those builds becomes 0.5% better than another build, the other build is deemed trash, it is no longer worthwhile, and it absolutely crashes into the ground. Look at crossbows, for example. Bows were pretty weak and terrible when crossbows were reigning supreme, using Hydrix bolts and Ruby bolts and Onyx bolts. And then as soon as God arrows came out, crossbows really started losing their value, and they crashed pretty quickly. Seal that fate by adding in Bow of the Last Guardian, and there is no one on this game right now who is unironically using crossbows in a serious capacity. Casual players might enjoy them because it is a cheap method, is a cheap source of damage to get into, but anyone seriously getting into PvM and trying to push the limits or has any inkling of wanting to do better in this game and become more efficient will not touch Serenic or Elite Serenic or Blight Bounds in any capacity. And the prices of these weapons reflect that. I believe the Blight set is under 300 mil right now. Serenic is, I think, 7 mil for the armor set. The only reason Elite Serenic is expensive is the fact that they are tied into ancient scales, which are used to make the armor that makes bows even stronger. Crossbows even got an update. The armor has a set effect to make them stronger and quote unquote more competitive with bows. But being that bow camp is stronger, crossbows have fallen down into the dark depths of the economy, and Bow of the Last Guardian and all of the bow side of range is well up into the stratosphere. Now imagine we took that same idea of crossbows and bows being separated and put that across all of the combat styles in game. That would be an absolute hellscape to play in and try and manage which thing is the best. Oh, someone came out with this, now I gotta buy that. And it would absolutely exacerbate the problems of the economy that we already have. It unironically ruins one of the iconic portions of this game. Overall, it is not a good idea. I have not enjoyed builds in any sense so far. At first, I was on board. I thought, oh yeah, builds are kind of a cool idea. Like, you know, with range, I can do like a crit focused build, or I can do like a poison build, and that's kind of cool. But then I realized that any place that I could do a poison build, it wasn't worthwhile. Poison build was significantly stronger at the places it worked, and the only reason that wasn't more obvious is there's only 3 bosses that it does work effectively at, because some bosses are susceptible to poison damage and most others are not. And after I came to that realization, I decided, no, I really don't want to see builds in game. I'd like to see some basic weapons for the combat style. So say 1 dual wield set, 1 two-hander set, and let them work together with a very nice ability range in order to achieve some really high-end damage. Do I want 17 switches in my inventory? Probably not, but certain ones I understand, like having a corroming swap is really nice for AoE specific specifically, and I think fits well overall into the different combat styles where it is used. This is where I get somewhat annoyed with melee, and even in its current state where we have a bunch of melee items that are in the inventory for melee camping, because it feels like there's too many switches with melee, although to be fair, they all have a unique purpose and it's not just kind of a bunch of the same things over and over again. The one you could probably get rid of is the tier 92 Masterwork Spear. That could just be some type of effect, or that could be some type of off global cooldown ability, or some type of effect or spell you activate with melee in order to buff up the bleeds, or it could just become an enchantment that is permanently bound to your account. Scythe makes sense because it's an AoE machine, it can hit farther because it's a larger weapon, so that one I do understand, but I think keeping the number of weapons to a relatively good range, so again, a dual wield set, a two-hander, maybe another two-hander if there is reason for it, and then just go hog wild on abilities and allow people to go crazy with rotations and really figure out stuff. Yes, this is a pie in the sky idea, and I've definitely gone on more so on a rant at this point rather than keeping it to a complete discussion. So I'll go ahead and do a recap here. Out of all the tier 95 weapon passives, I enjoy the first one the most. The bleed one is pretty annoying to use and isn't that great of an increase in my opinion. The second one is RNG with reducing magic cooldown, and I'm already kind of annoyed with RNG as a whole, at least for stack building and dealing with stuff like that. So I'd rather just see the first one come into game where it is a consistent, you do this, this happens type of scenario. And overall, that's how I feel about the T95s. As far as charging is concerned, I think it is a terrible idea that does not address the problem that it was designed to, and is mostly just a coping mechanism. And builds, I believe, are a terrible idea for this game because they're going to be a nightmare to balance that will horribly disrupt the economy from game update to game update based on which one gets patched and which one gets nerfed. And I believe it gets rid of one of the big unique characteristics that RuneScape has, being that we are able to switch armor and weapons mid-fight. Now again, if you have any comments, questions, or discussion, please keep it civil down there. I understand these are potentially hot takes, but they are my opinions and I am going to put them out there because I know quite a few people agree with me but aren't really willing to say it because they don't want to potentially go against the grain of Redditors and other people of the sort. But before I ramble on for another hour or so, or however long this video is, I'm just going to close the video out here. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate the viewership as always. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, nighttime, whatever it is, wherever you are, and I'll see y'all next time for the next video. Peace.